The moment Ryan stepped into the role of president, something shifted. Not overnight, not all at once, but steadily, like an unseen tide pulling him away from who he used to be. I had always admired his ambition, his drive to prove himself beyond the shadow of his father, Robert, the formidable man who built our company from the ground up. But now, that ambition had twisted into something unrecognizable. I sat at the long mahogany conference table, my fingers tapping lightly against the sleek surface as I waited. The air in the boardroom was thick with an anticipation that had soured into frustration. The staff had gathered, expecting the routine Monday meeting where Ryan, as the new president, would outline the week's goals. Except Ryan wasn't here. Again, whispers threaded through the room. Eyes met mine, some questioning, others resigned. I could see the same silent thoughts reflected in their faces. He's not coming. I glanced at my watch. 10 minutes late. I reached for my phone and sent a quick text. Where are you? The staff is waiting. No response. Swallowing my frustration, I straightened and turned toward the expectant team. It seems Ryan has been delayed, I said smoothly, though my voice lacked conviction. We'll proceed with our agenda for now. No one looked surprised. As we pushed through the updates, I struggled to focus. My mind kept circling back to the man I had built a life with, the one who, not too long ago, had been just as invested in these meetings as I was. Before he was president, we worked side by side, sharing ideas, bouncing strategies off one another late into the night. We had been a team, a partnership built on mutual respect and the shared dream of leading the company together. But now, Ryan acted as if the business was his personal kingdom, and we were merely subjects waiting for his decree. 15 minutes in, the door finally swung open. Ryan strolled in, exuding a cool confidence that might have been charismatic if not for the utter disregard it carried. He barely acknowledged the room, heading straight for the head of the table. Sorry, he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't sorry at all. Something more important came up. More important. The word stung, but I forced my expression to remain neutral. We've already started, I informed him, sliding the agenda toward him. He took one glance at the document and pushed it aside. I'll catch up later. Let's wrap this up, I have another engagement soon. The tension in the room thickened. Several department heads shifted in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. I noticed Robert at the far end of the table, his sharp, assessing gaze fixed on his son. He said nothing, but I could tell he was filing this moment away, adding it to whatever growing concerns he already had. Despite my best efforts, the meeting ended on an empty note. No real direction, no leadership. Just Ryan's vague promises to follow up on key concerns, a phrase we all knew meant little. As people filed out, I lingered, watching my husband lean back in his chair, scrolling through his phone. Ryan, I said quietly. He didn't look up. What's going on with you? I folded my arms. You've been skipping meetings, dismissing concerns. This isn't like you. Now, he did look up. And in his eyes, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Not irritation. Not frustration. Indifference. Emma, I'm the president now, he said, as if that explained everything. I don't need to be at every little meeting. That's what I have a team for. A team you're supposed to lead, I countered. Ryan, this company isn't just a title. I know what it is, he cut in, his voice sharpening. And I don't need a lecture. I exhaled slowly, reining in my growing unease. Robert is worried, I tried again, shifting tactics. He thinks. My father always thinks I'm failing, Ryan interrupted, pushing back his chair with an exasperated sigh. That's the problem, Emma. He never believed in me. He's just waiting for me to mess up so he can swoop back in and say, I told you so. I frowned. That's not true. He gave you this position because he believed in you. But leadership isn't about power, it's about responsibility. Ryan scoffed, standing. You sound just like him. And maybe that's something you should think about, I shot back. He stared at me for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his expression. Then, without another word, he walked out. I stood there, the weight of the conversation pressing down on me. When I turned, I found Robert still in the room, watching. He approached, his face etched with something that looked like both concern and inevitability. "He's changing," I murmured. Robert nodded, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Power does that to people." He paused, then added, "But it doesn't have to." I knew what he was saying. The man Ryan was becoming, that was a choice. And if he kept making the wrong ones, there would come a point where I'd have to make a choice, too. One I wasn't sure I was ready for. The office had grown eerily quiet. It wasn't the normal kind of quiet that came from a productive workday. This was the heavy silence of unspoken concerns, of tension lingering in the air like a storm waiting to break. The staff meeting had been canceled again. I sat at my desk, staring at the email I had just sent out. Subject: Staff meeting cancellation. Dear team, unfortunately, today's meeting has been canceled. Please proceed with your department reports as usual. Let me know if you need anything. Best, Emma. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I hesitated before shutting my laptop. The truth was, I didn't have a real explanation for them. Ryan had dismissed the meeting without a second thought, brushing it off as unnecessary. But the looks on our employees' faces, the growing disappointment in their eyes, told me otherwise. The company was unraveling under his leadership. He was unraveling. And I had no idea how to stop it. The faint murmur of voices from Ryan's office caught my attention. His door was slightly ajar, just enough for sound to slip through. I wasn't one to eavesdrop, but something about the low, affectionate tone in his voice made me pause. "Come on, Vanessa," he said, a chuckle weaving through his words. "You know I miss you too." My breath hitched. "Vanessa?" I inched closer, my pulse hammering in my ears. No, don't worry about that," Ryan continued smoothly. "She doesn't suspect a thing." The room tilted slightly, the words slicing through me like a blade. "She doesn't suspect a thing." My fingers curled into fists as I pressed myself against the wall, trying to steady my breath. I had to be mistaken. This had to be some misunderstanding. But deep in my gut, I already knew the truth. Vanessa. A name I had never heard him mention before. A name that carried an intimacy he hadn't shown toward me in months. I forced myself to take a deep breath to calm the whirlwind of emotions threatening to spiral out of control. I needed proof. Jumping to conclusions would get me nowhere. But how do you reason with something so painfully obvious? I peeked into his office just in time to see him lean back in his chair, his expression smug, his phone still pressed to his ear. He looked different. Relaxed. Amused. Almost happy. I turned away, nausea curling in my stomach. This wasn't just about Ryan neglecting his duties at work anymore. This was something far worse. By the time I returned to my desk, my hands were shaking. I clenched them in my lap, willing myself to stay calm. There was no denying what I had heard, but I wasn't ready to confront him, not yet. I needed to understand the full scope of whatever this was. Minutes passed, and then an hour. I sat frozen, trapped in my own thoughts, until a gentle knock at my door pulled me back to reality. Robert. His presence alone was grounding. With his graying hair and the sharp, knowing gaze that had built this company from nothing, he was a man who never missed a single detail. Today, his expression was unreadable. "Got a minute?" he asked, stepping inside. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course." He took a seat across from me, his hands clasped together. "The staff is starting to talk, Emma." I swallowed. "About the meetings?" "About Ryan." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Robert sighed, leaning back. "I was hoping I was wrong," he admitted, his voice heavy. "Hoping he'd grow into this role, but he's not leading, he's ruling. There's a difference." I nodded slowly, choosing my words carefully. "He's changed." Robert studied me, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "Something happened, didn't it?" I hesitated. Should I tell him what I had overheard? Would that be crossing a line? Before I could decide, my phone buzzed. A text from Ryan. "Going to lunch. Don't wait up." It was nothing out of the ordinary, except for the fact that I already knew who he was likely having lunch with. Vanessa. The name pulsed in my mind like a warning. I looked up at Robert and made my choice. "There's someone else," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't flinch. If anything, he looked as if he had suspected it all along. "Are you sure?" he asked. I overheard him on the phone. My throat tightened. He sounded happy. Robert exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to the desk between us. He was quiet for a long moment before finally meeting my eyes again. "This company means a lot to me, Emma," he said. "But you mean more." His words nearly broke me. "Don't let him take you down with him," he warned gently. Tears burned at the back of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "I don't know what to do," I admitted. He leaned forward, his voice steady. "You already do." I nodded, understanding his meaning. Ryan wasn't just endangering our company anymore. He was endangering us. And I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The tension in the office had reached a breaking point. It wasn't just the murmurs of discontent from employees or the way meetings were increasingly disregarded. It was the way Ryan carried himself now, like a man who had outgrown accountability. He walked into the building every morning with an air of arrogance that had once been mistaken for confidence. Now it was nothing but carelessness. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, hoping to get ahead of whatever chaos the day would bring. As I settled into my desk, I skimmed through the latest emails. Complaints. Again. More and more employees were speaking up about Ryan's erratic leadership, his refusal to make decisions, his complete disregard for the company's long-term stability. Just as I was about to forward the most pressing concerns to him, knowing full well he would likely ignore them, his office door swung open. "Emma," Ryan called out casually, as if he hadn't been absent from nearly every major decision in the past month. I looked up, bracing myself. "Yes." He strolled toward me, adjusting the cuffs of his pristine white shirt, his suit jacket slung over one shoulder. "Cancel my afternoon meetings." I frowned. "Ryan, those meetings are important. The finance team needs." "I don't care what they need," he interrupted, flashing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "I've got somewhere to be." I folded my arms. "And where exactly is that?" His smile widened, but there was a smugness behind it that made my stomach twist. "Lunch. With Vanessa?" The name slipped from my lips before I could stop it. Something flickered in his expression, annoyance, maybe, or amusement. "Why? Are you keeping tabs on me now?" I inhaled sharply. "Ryan, I'm trying to run this company while I'm what?" He cut me off, his voice dropping into something colder. "While I'm actually enjoying my life?" A sharp silence stretched between us. I could feel the eyes of our employees flicking toward us from behind their desks. They weren't outright staring, but they were listening. I refused to let him bait me into an argument in front of them. So instead, I let out a slow breath and reached for my phone. "Fine," I said, my voice level. "I'll let everyone know you won't be available." Again. He smirked, taking that as a victory. "Good girl." I clenched my fists under my desk as he walked away, leaving behind nothing but the bitter aftertaste of his arrogance. By noon, the office had turned into a battleground. Employees were fed up. Some were storming into my office, demanding answers for Ryan's absence. Others were quietly voicing their concerns, afraid of being the next person he pushed out for questioning his leadership. The finance department, in particular, was in turmoil. Robert arrived shortly after, his expression unreadable as he walked past Ryan's empty office and headed straight for mine. "Tell me he didn't just leave again," he said as he sat across from me. I pinched the bridge of my nose. "He did." Robert let out a humorless chuckle. "Unbelievable." I nodded toward the growing stack of complaints on my desk. "And people are noticing." The board included. He studied me for a moment before speaking. "Emma, you need to start thinking about your future. About what happens if this," he gestured toward the papers, "gets worse." I swallowed the lump in my throat. I had already thought about it. Too many times. But the truth was, I wasn't ready to admit that I couldn't fix this. Robert sighed, as if reading my hesitation. "Ryan is making choices. Bad ones. And if he doesn't course-correct soon, he'll take everything down with him." I looked away. "He's not listening to me anymore." "I know." Robert's voice softened. "But you can't let him drag you down with him." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, the office doors swung open and Ryan strolled back in. He wasn't alone. Vanessa. She walked beside him, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her bright blonde hair cascading over her shoulders like she owned the place. The way she laughed, light and airy, too familiar, sent a bolt of fury through me. Ryan barely acknowledged the chaos unfolding around us. Instead, he headed straight toward his office, Vanessa in tow, as if this was just another normal day. Murmurs broke out across the office. Employees exchanged glances, whispers growing louder. This wasn't just an affair anymore. This was a public humiliation. Robert's jaw tightened. Unbelievable. I forced myself to stand, ignoring the way my legs trembled. I'll handle it. Without another word, I walked straight to Ryan's office and pushed the door open before he could shut it in my face. Emma, he said lazily, leaning against his desk. Vanessa stood beside him, arms crossed, a smirk playing on her lips. I ignored her. You're bringing her here now? I demanded, barely containing my anger. In front of everyone? Ryan's grin widened, but there was an edge to it. Vanessa's here on business. I scoffed. Business? She's consulting for the company, he said smoothly. I figured it was time we brought in fresh perspectives. A cold wave of realization hit me. He wasn't just having an affair, he was putting her in my place. I turned to Vanessa, my voice dangerously calm. You're consulting? Since when? She tilted her head, pretending to think. Oh, just recently. Ryan thought it would be best to have someone with an outside perspective. My fingers curled into fists. You have no experience in this field. Vanessa shrugged, flashing Ryan a knowing smile. I have the right experience. The smugness in her tone, the casual way she dismissed my entire career, made something inside me snap. I turned back to Ryan, my voice steady but firm. You're making a mistake. His smirk faltered. I have given everything to this company, I continued. I've built it, protected it. And you're willing to throw it away for... I gestured toward Vanessa. This? Ryan's expression darkened. Emma, don't test me. I met his gaze without flinching. Or what? For a moment, the room was suffocating with unspoken words. Then, just as quickly, Ryan straightened and waved a dismissive hand. I don't have time for this. He glanced at Vanessa. Let's go. I stepped aside, watching as they walked past me like I was nothing more than an obstacle in their path. But as I turned, I met Robert's eyes through the glass walls of the office. He had seen everything. And for the first time, I saw something in his expression that terrified me more than anything. Not anger. Not disappointment. Finality. This was the beginning of the end. By the time I left the office, the sun had already started its slow descent behind the city skyline, streaking the sky with hues of deep orange and dusky violet. The day had been an unrelenting storm of emotions: Ryan's blatant disregard for the company, his audacity in bringing Vanessa into our workspace, and the quiet yet heavy looks from employees who no longer saw him as their leader. But it was the finality in Robert's expression that lingered with me the most. I pulled into our driveway, exhaustion pressing against me like a weight I couldn't shake. As I turned off the engine, I sat still for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to gather the strength to face whatever waited inside. This house, once our sanctuary, now felt foreign to me. It used to be filled with laughter, late-night conversations over takeout, and the quiet comfort of knowing I was loved. Now, it was just walls and furniture, a shell of what it used to be. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door, my heels clicking against the pavement. Just as I reached for the handle, a movement in my peripheral vision made me pause. A woman was stepping out of the house. Not just any woman. Vanessa. For a moment, I couldn't move. My body felt frozen in place, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing. She stood there, her long blonde hair cascading over her shoulders in effortless waves, a smug smile playing on her lips. She looked comfortable, too comfortable. She wasn't just leaving. She belonged here. Oh, she said, feigning surprise as if she hadn't expected to see me. You're home. My heart pounded in my chest. What the hell are you doing here? She tilted her head, her amusement only growing. I was just leaving my house. I swallowed hard, my pulse roaring in my ears. You have no right to be here. Her smirk deepened, and she stepped closer, lowering her voice as if she were sharing a secret. Oh, but I do. She glanced toward the door before looking back at me. Ryan invited me. The words hit me like a slap. Ryan, this wasn't just a fling. This wasn't some meaningless mistake. This was a deliberate betrayal. I forced myself to stand taller, even as my legs trembled beneath me. I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, I said, my voice steady despite the rage bubbling beneath the surface, but this is my home. My marriage. Vanessa laughed softly, shaking her head as if I were naive. Oh, Emma, she said, almost pityingly. I think you're the only one still holding on to that illusion. My breath caught in my throat. Before I could respond, the door opened behind her. Ryan. He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up as if he had just been relaxing inside our home. With her. Our eyes met, and for the briefest moment, I saw something flicker there. Guilt? Hesitation? Or just the anticipation of a confrontation he had no intention of losing. What's going on? He asked, though his voice lacked any real concern. I turned my attention back to Vanessa. Get out. She only smiled, stepping past me as if she had already won. See you around, she murmured before sauntering toward her car. I barely noticed her drive away. My focus was locked onto Ryan, my husband, the man I had loved for years, the man who had just shattered every last bit of trust one had left. You let her into our home, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face as if this entire situation was just an inconvenience to him. Emma, don't make this a bigger deal than it is. A bitter laugh escaped me. A bigger deal? You brought your mistress into our house, Ryan. He flinched at the word mistress, but quickly recovered, his jaw tightening. I didn't think you'd be home this early. I stared at him, disbelief washing over me like ice water. That was his defense? That's what you have to say? My voice rose, my emotions unraveling faster than I could control them. Not an apology, not an explanation, just that you didn't think I'd catch you. Ryan sighed heavily, stepping back inside. Come in, Emma. Let's talk. I hesitated for only a moment before following him, shutting the door behind me. The house felt suffocating now, the walls closing in, every piece of furniture suddenly tainted with betrayal. Ryan ran a hand through his hair, avoiding my gaze. Look, he started, I know this isn't ideal. Ideal? I cut him off, my voice trembling. Ryan, I just caught you cheating on me in our own damn home. He exhaled, clearly frustrated. You're overreacting. My breath caught, fury burning through me like wildfire. Overreacting. I repeated, my hands shaking at my sides. Ryan, do you even hear yourself? You've been shutting me out, neglecting the company, and now this. He finally looked at me then, something unreadable in his expression. Things haven't been good between us for a while, Emma. I took a step back, as if physically recoiling from the words. So that's your excuse? I whispered. He shook his head, his posture tense. It's not an excuse. It's the truth. Silence stretched between us. I searched his face for any trace of the man I had married, the man who had once held me in his arms and promised me forever. But I couldn't find him. He was gone. Or maybe he had never really been here at all. I swallowed hard, my vision blurring. I gave you everything, Ryan, I said, my voice breaking. I stood by you. I fought for you. And this is what I get. He didn't answer. Because there was no answer that would ever be enough. I turned toward the stairs, my body moving on autopilot. I'm packing a bag, I said. Ryan's head snapped up. Emma, I'm leaving. His expression hardened. Where will you go? I paused, my heart hammering. And then, the answer came easily. Robert. For the first time, real panic flickered across his face. But I didn't care. I had nothing left to lose. And as I walked up those stairs, Leaving him standing alone in the living room, I knew this was only the beginning. The beginning of the end. I sat in the dimly lit guest room of Robert's estate, my suitcase half unpacked on the bed. It had been hours since I walked out of my house, leaving Ryan behind with nothing but the weight of his own choices. But even here, in the warmth of a home that wasn't mine, I felt the echoes of betrayal pressing in on me. Robert had barely asked any questions when I showed up at his door. He had simply opened it, taken one look at my face, and nodded. "Stay as long as you need," he had said. And now here I was, alone. The past few hours played in my mind like a cruel film on loop. Vanessa stepping out of my house, the smug tilt of her lips, Ryan's indifferent expression, the way he had barely tried to stop me. I let out a shaky breath and pressed my fingers to my temple. I had spent years building a life with Ryan, supporting him, standing beside him when he doubted himself. And now he had thrown it all away for a woman who hadn't earned any of it. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. I straightened, wiping at the corners of my eyes before calling out, "Come in." Robert stepped inside, his face unreadable, though his eyes held a quiet understanding. He was dressed in his usual tailored suit, a man who carried authority effortlessly, but tonight there was something else in his presence, something almost fatherly. "I thought you might need this," he said, holding out a glass of whiskey. I hesitated for only a moment before taking it. "Thank you." He sat down across from me, his movements slow, measured. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to." I stared into the amber liquid before taking a sip, letting the burn settle in my throat. "He didn't even fight for me," I said finally. Robert exhaled through his nose, leaning back in his chair. "Ryan has always been a man who thinks he's invincible. He believes he can have everything, that there will never be consequences." He paused. "But there always are." I nodded slowly, my grip tightening around the glass. "He told me things hadn't been good between us for a while," I murmured. Robert's gaze sharpened. "That's his way of justifying his own failures." A bitter laugh escaped me. "I should have seen it coming." "You loved him," Robert said simply. "You believed in him." "That's not something to be ashamed of." I looked away. "And now what?" "He gets to destroy our marriage and the company, and I just sit back and watch." Robert's expression darkened slightly. "That's the question, isn't it?" I met his eyes, something shifting inside me. "He's ruining everything." Robert took a slow sip of his drink before setting the glass down. "Then don't let him." His words hung in the air between us, heavier than anything he had said before. "I gave him everything," I whispered. "My time, my loyalty, my voice caught. I don't even know who I am without him." Robert leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "Then maybe it's time to find out." The words settled deep in my chest, sparking something I hadn't felt in a long time: resolve. I wasn't just a wife Ryan had discarded. I wasn't just an executive he had pushed aside. I was Emma. And I wasn't going to let him destroy everything I had worked for. The next morning, I sat in Robert's sunlit kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. I hesitated before glancing at the screen. Ryan. I stared at the name, my pulse quickening. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let him sit in his own mess. But the other part, the part that still ached from the betrayal, wanted to hear what excuse he had come up with now. I answered. "Emma." Ryan's voice came through, still groggy, as if he had just woken up. I remained silent, waiting. He sighed. "Look, we need to talk." I let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, now you want to talk?" "Emma, don't do this," he said, his voice laced with irritation. "We need to be adults about this." "Adults?" I repeated, gripping my coffee mug. "You had an affair, Ryan. In our house. And now you want to act like this is just some business transaction we need to negotiate." There was a pause. "I never meant for it to happen like this." I closed my eyes, shaking my head. "Then how did you mean for it to happen?" Silence. "That's what I thought," I muttered. He exhaled sharply. "Emma, listen." Things got complicated. The company, my father, us, I felt trapped. My stomach twisted. "So, what?" "You decided the solution was to betray me." I wasn't thinking straight. I clenched my jaw. "No, Ryan. You were thinking about yourself. Another silence. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its edge. I don't want this to get ugly. My throat tightened. It already is. I mean legally, he clarified. I don't want us to drag this out. It'll just hurt both of us. I frowned. What are you saying? There was a beat of hesitation before he spoke again. I've had divorce papers drawn up. The words knocked the air from my lungs. I'll sign them first, he continued, as if that was some grand act of generosity. To make it easier for you. I gripped the counter to steady myself. Divorce. The final nail in the coffin. Emma? I forced myself to breathe. Send them. A pause. Just like that? I let out a slow exhale. You already made this decision, Ryan. I'm just accepting it. For the first time, he seemed thrown off. Maybe he had expected me to cry, to beg, to fight for a marriage he had already abandoned. But I was done. Fine, he muttered. I'll have them sent over today. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Goodbye, Ryan. And then I hung up. For a long moment, I just stood there, the silence of the kitchen pressing in around me. Then, slowly, I walked toward the window, letting the sunlight warm my face. I had just closed a door on a life I thought I couldn't live without. But as I stood there, feeling the weight begin to lift, I realized something. Maybe, just maybe, I was finally free. I walked into the office the next morning with my head held high, determined not to let the weight of my personal life seep into my professional one. But as soon as I stepped through the glass doors of the executive floor, I felt the shift in energy. The office had always been a place of quiet efficiency, a hum of productivity filling the air. Today, though, there was something different, an undercurrent of tension, whispers barely concealed behind computer screens, and the unmistakable presence of something wrong. Then I saw her. Vanessa. She stood near the center of the main office space, flipping through a portfolio with all the ease of someone who had no business being here. She was dressed as if she had just walked off a magazine cover, an expensive, form-fitting suit, her long blonde hair styled in loose waves. She looked completely at home. Too at home. I barely had time to process it before Ryan stepped out of his office, his presence commanding attention. He smiled at Vanessa, and then, without hesitation, placed a hand on the small of her back. In front of everyone. The air left my lungs. The whispers grew louder. Employees cast me uncertain, pitying glances as if waiting to see my reaction. My stomach churned with a mix of anger and humiliation. Ryan didn't just bring her here. He wanted me to see her here. He was making a statement. And then he delivered the final blow. Ryan clapped his hands together, gathering the room's attention. Everyone, he called out, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction, I'd like to introduce you to Vanessa. She'll be joining us as a special consultant moving forward. A few stunned moments passed before polite, scattered applause followed. No one dared to question it out loud, but I could feel the confusion. A special consultant? For what? My pulse pounded in my ears. This was a deliberate humiliation, a power move designed to put me in my place. I stepped forward, my heels clicking against the marble floor as I approached them. Ryan, I said coolly, my voice steady despite the fury burning inside me. Can I have a word? His lips twitched, as if he had been expecting this. Of course, darling. I ignored the sickly sweetness in his tone, turning on my heel and striding toward my office. I could hear him following behind me, his arrogance practically radiating off him. As soon as the door shut behind us, I rounded on him. What the hell do you think you're doing? Ryan leaned casually against my desk, crossing his arms. Bringing in fresh talent, he said with a smirk. I let out a sharp laugh. Fresh talent? She has no experience in this industry. His eyes darkened slightly, but the smirk never left. She has other talents, he murmured. A wave of nausea rolled through me. This is about humiliating me, I said, my voice cold. You could have had your affair in private, but no. You had to flaunt it. You had to bring her here. Ryan sighed, pushing off the desk. Emma, let's be adults about this. Our marriage is over. You signed the divorce papers. There's no reason we can't work together professionally. I stared at him, my fingers digging into my palms. Professionally? I repeated. You don't even know what that word means anymore. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. This is happening whether you like it or not. Vanessa is staying and as my wife. I let out a humorless laugh. Ex-wife. As my employee, he corrected smoothly, you'll assist her as needed. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. He wasn't just trying to hurt me. He wanted to break me. For a moment, I considered screaming at him, throwing something, demanding that he see reason. But then I realized there was no reason left in Ryan. He was beyond saving. I straightened my shoulders, taking a deep breath before speaking. You're making a mistake, I said evenly. A big one. His smirk faltered, just for a second. Then, with quiet certainty, I added, and I won't be around to watch you destroy everything. Ryan frowned. What's that supposed to mean? I didn't answer. Instead, I turned and walked out of my office, my mind already made up. I headed straight for Robert's office. Robert was seated at his desk, reading over reports when I entered. He looked up immediately, his sharp eyes narrowing. I heard what happened, he said before I could even speak. I swallowed hard. He brought her here, I said, voice tight. He appointed her. Robert exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. That boy is a fool. I let out a bitter laugh. That's an understatement. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Robert gestured to the chair across from him. Sit. I did, my hands clasped in my lap. You can't keep working under him, he said simply. I nodded. I know. Robert leaned forward. The board is losing patience. They see what's happening, Emma. His leadership is a disaster. We're already planning an emergency meeting to address it. I frowned. What does that mean? Robert studied me. It means Ryan may not be in charge much longer. A flicker of something hope rushed through me. If we take this to a vote, Robert continued, we can have him removed. I hesitated. And what happens to the company after that? Robert's gaze was steady. That depends. I took a slow breath, weighing my options. If I step away now, I lose any influence I have left. Robert nodded. Yes, but if you stay, you'll have to endure his power plays until we can remove him. It wasn't a choice I had expected to make so soon. Stay and fight? Or walk away on my own terms? My stomach twisted. I need to think about it. Robert nodded. Take your time. But not too much. I stood, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me. As I left his office, I knew one thing for certain: Ryan had drawn the battle lines. But he had underestimated me. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The day after Ryan publicly humiliated me in the office, I arrived at work knowing exactly what I needed to do. I had spent the entire night thinking no, deciding. Ryan thought he could break me. That he could strip me of my dignity, bring his mistress into my company, and leave me no choice but to endure it. But he had underestimated me. I wasn't staying to be humiliated. I was staying to end him. When I stepped onto the executive floor, the energy in the air was different. The usual hush of quiet professionalism had been replaced with an uneasy buzz, a current of tension threading through the office. Employees whispered in corners, their gazes flicking toward me before quickly looking away. Something had happened. And then I saw them, Ryan and Vanessa, standing outside his office. But they weren't alone. A man I didn't recognize, a corporate lawyer, judging by his crisp, no-nonsense suit, stood between them, holding a thick stack of documents. Ryan's expression was unreadable, but Vanessa looked smug. I knew that whatever this was, it wouldn't be good. I squared my shoulders and walked toward them, keeping my pace steady, my expression calm. I refused to show even a flicker of weakness. Ryan turned as I approached, his lips curling into something that might have been a smirk if not for the tension in his eyes. Emma, he said smoothly. Perfect timing. I stopped a few feet away, crossing my arms. What's going on? The lawyer, without hesitation, extended the stack of documents toward me. Mrs. Carter, I've been asked to deliver these to you personally. I took them, already knowing, already feeling, what they were before I even looked. But I looked anyway. Divorce papers. Ryan had signed them. The ink was fresh, the bold signature at the bottom of the page unmistakable. For a moment, the world felt distant. The words on the page blurred slightly, and I swallowed against the lump rising in my throat. I had expected this. I had agreed to this. But the reality of it, the finality of his betrayal, still cut deep. I forced myself to meet his gaze. You didn't even have the decency to do this in private? Ryan shrugged, the picture of careless arrogance. I wanted to make things official. Besides, he gestured toward Vanessa. It's time we all moved on. Vanessa smiled, looping her arm through Ryan's like she had already won. I let out a slow breath, gripping the papers tightly before lowering them to my side. My heart pounded, but my voice was steady when I spoke. You really are a coward, aren't you? The smirk faltered just slightly. I stepped closer, my gaze never leaving his. You couldn't face me like a man, so you had to make a spectacle of this. Because deep down, you know you're losing control. His jaw tightened. Don't be dramatic, Emma. I let out a humorless laugh. Dramatic? You paraded your affair around this office, shoved her into a position she's unqualified for, and now, instead of handling our divorce with dignity, you pull this stunt? Tell me, Ryan, do you even recognize yourself anymore? For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. But before he could respond, Vanessa stepped forward, her voice sickeningly sweet. Oh, Emma, she cooed. Let's not make this messy. Ryan and I are just trying to move forward, and frankly, we don't need your bitterness dragging us down. I turned to her slowly, tilting my head. Bitterness? I repeated. You think I'm bitter? Vanessa smiled, all teeth. A little, yeah. I smiled back, except mine wasn't friendly. No, Vanessa, I said, my voice like steel. I'm not bitter. I'm just not stupid. She blinked, thrown off. I shifted my gaze back to Ryan. You're making a mistake, I said calmly. A big one. And when it all comes crashing down, don't expect me to save you. Ryan scoffed. You think I need saving? I leaned in slightly, my voice dropping just enough for only him to hear. I know you do. And then, before he could say another word, I turned on my heel and walked away. I didn't run. I didn't crumble. I walked. With my dignity intact. Hours later, I found myself in Robert's office again, the divorce papers resting on the desk between us. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking. Are you okay? I let out a slow breath. No, I admitted. But I will be. He nodded, seeming to accept that. Then he leaned back in his chair. I spoke with the board, he said. They're moving forward with an emergency meeting. I stiffened. To remove Ryan? Robert nodded. His reckless decisions have put the company at risk. The financial reports are worse than even I expected. My stomach twisted. So what happens next? He studied me. That depends on you. I frowned. Me? Robert clasped his hands together. Emma, you're smart. You're capable. The board trusts you, and they don't trust Ryan. He paused. If you wanted to step in, help clean up the mess he's made, there's a seat for you. I inhaled sharply. You're offering me a position? He nodded. Not just any position. Leadership. 1,000 thoughts rushed through my mind at once. Stay and rebuild? Or walk away and start fresh? I hesitated, my fingers trailing over the edge of the papers on his desk. If I do this, it's not for revenge, I said slowly. Robert's lips twitched. I wouldn't expect anything less. I let out a breath. I need time to think. Robert nodded. Take your time. But not too much. As I left his office, my mind swirled with the weight of the decision ahead. Ryan thought he had won today. But he had no idea that his downfall had already begun. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the afternoon, but the atmosphere in the office had been uneasy since morning. News traveled fast in corporate spaces, and by now, nearly everyone knew what was about to happen. Ryan might have believed himself untouchable, but the truth was evident to those who had been paying attention. His reckless leadership had set the company on a downward spiral. I arrived early, not because I had a formal role in this meeting, but because I needed to see it unfold. I wasn't here for revenge, but I wasn't going to look away when karma finally came for Ryan. As I stepped into the conference room, the tension was thick. The long, Polished mahogany table gleamed under the overhead lighting, and the board members were already seated, murmuring among themselves. Some glanced in my direction, their expressions unreadable. Then the door opened again, and Ryan walked in. He carried himself as if nothing was wrong, as if this were just another routine meeting where he could charm or bulldoze his way through objections. He wore his confidence like a shield, but I knew better. I could see the faint tightness around his mouth, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Robert arrived last, his presence commanding. He took his seat at the head of the table, and the murmurs died instantly. Ryan smirked, leaning back in his chair. "So, what's this about?" he asked casually. Robert's gaze was level. "You know exactly what this is about." Ryan chuckled. "Dad, if this is another one of your lectures." "This is not a lecture," Robert cut in sharply. "It's an accountability meeting. The board has concerns, serious concerns, about your leadership." Ryan scoffed, but I could see the shift in his posture. He was listening now, even if he pretended not to care. One of the board members, an older man named Leonard, cleared his throat. "Ryan, we've reviewed the latest financial reports. The company's performance has declined drastically under your leadership. There have been multiple complaints from department heads about mismanagement and lack of direction." Another board member, Elaine, adjusted her glasses. "Your decision to cancel key meetings, your neglect of ongoing projects, and, let's not forget, the hiring of unqualified personnel in executive roles have all raised red flags." Her tone was sharp, unyielding. I didn't have to look at Ryan to know she was talking about Vanessa. Ryan straightened, his smirk faltering just slightly. "This is absurd," he said. "The company is fine. We're just making bold decisions." Robert leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Bold? You call recklessness bold? You've lost major clients, neglected strategic partnerships, and alienated the people who have built this company with us. Do you really think the board hasn't noticed?" Ryan exhaled sharply, sitting up. "So what, you're all ganging up on me now?" He let out a short laugh, but there was no real humor in it. "You've been waiting for this, haven't you? Waiting for a reason to push me out." Robert's expression didn't change. "No one wanted this, Ryan. But you've given us no choice." Ryan's jaw clenched, but he still tried to play it cool. "All right," he said, spreading his hands. "If you want to talk numbers, let's talk numbers. Every company has its ups and downs. What we're experiencing now is just a temporary dip." Elaine shook her head. "That's not how business works, Ryan. This isn't a dip. It's a collapse." Another board member, Malcolm, leaned forward. "You were given this position because we trusted you to carry on Robert's legacy. Instead, you've squandered that trust." Ryan's eyes darkened. "And what exactly do you all plan to do about it?" Silence stretched for a moment. Then Robert spoke. "We're voting on your removal as president." The air shifted. Even Ryan's bravado couldn't mask his reaction. His fingers tightened against the table's edge, his jaw visibly clenching. "You're kidding," he said, his voice a shade quieter. Robert's gaze didn't waver. "No, Ryan, we're not." One by one, the board members cast their votes. It was over in less than 5 minutes. Unanimous. Ryan Carter was officially removed as president of the company. I watched as he processed the reality of what had just happened. His face went pale for the briefest moment before anger took over. "This is bullshit," he hissed, shoving back his chair. He turned to Robert, his voice sharp. "You've wanted this from the start, haven't you? You could never let me win." Robert exhaled slowly. "This wasn't about winning, Ryan. It was about leading. And you failed." Ryan's hands curled into fists. He turned his glare on me. "And you," he snapped. "You must be thrilled right now." I met his gaze without flinching. "No, Ryan," I said softly. "I'm just disappointed." For a moment, something flickered across his face, something raw, something almost real. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. He scoffed, shaking his head as he turned toward the door. "You're all going to regret this," he muttered before storming out. The moment he was gone, the room exhaled as one. Tension loosened, shoulders relaxed. It was done. I stood, turning to leave, but Robert's voice stopped me. "Emma." I glanced back. He studied me for a moment before nodding slightly. You did well. I nodded in return, then walked out. Ryan didn't leave the office immediately. I found him in the hallway, pacing, running a hand through his hair. The moment he saw me, he stiffened. What do you want? He muttered. I crossed my arms. What happens next is up to you, Ryan. He scoffed. Don't give me the be the bigger person speech, Emma. I sighed. You could still make something of yourself, you know. If you stop blaming everyone else for your failures. His jaw clenched. Is that what you think? That I'm a failure? I held his gaze. I think you made choices. Bad choices. And now you have to live with them. A long silence stretched between us. Then Ryan let out a sharp exhale. You really are done with me, aren't you? I nodded. I was done the moment you stopped being someone worth fighting for. Something in his posture sagged. But I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked away. This time, I wasn't looking back. I stepped into the crisp morning air, inhaling deeply as the weight of the past few months finally started to lift from my shoulders. It was strange, the way life could change so drastically in such a short amount of time. Just weeks ago, I had been stuck in a marriage that was crumbling around me, tethered to a man who had long since stopped being the person I fell in love with. I had stood by his side, hoping, waiting, believing that he would find his way back. But Ryan had made his choices. And now, I was making mine. The office was different without him. The tension that had once permeated every hallway, every boardroom, was gone. There was no more fear of rash decisions, no more scrambling to cover for a leader who refused to lead. The employees who had once walked on eggshells now moved with renewed energy, the weight of uncertainty lifted from their shoulders. I hadn't officially decided whether I was going to stay. After Ryan's removal, the board had extended an offer for me to take on a greater leadership role, a position that would allow me to help rebuild what had been nearly destroyed. It was tempting. This company had been my home for so long, our home, I had once believed. But the wounds were still too fresh for me to commit. I spent the morning reviewing project reports, slipping back into my usual rhythm. But even as I worked, there was a question that lingered at the back of my mind. Did I want to be here anymore? A knock at my door pulled me from my thoughts. I looked up to find Robert standing there, his expression as unreadable as ever. Got a minute? He asked. I nodded, gesturing for him to take a seat. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. The board needs an answer. I exhaled, setting my pen down. I know. Robert studied me for a moment before leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Emma, you don't owe this company anything. You've already done more for it than most people will ever know. But if you want to stay, if you want to lead, we need you. I hesitated. And if I say no? Robert didn't flinch. Then you walk away with your head held high, knowing you left this place better than when you found it. The simplicity of his answer surprised me. For so long, I had felt tied to this company, to Ryan. Even after everything he had done, I had struggled to separate my identity from the life we had built together. But the truth was, I wasn't obligated to stay. I wasn't trapped here. I had a choice. And for the first time in a long time, I wanted to choose me. I met Robert's gaze. I think it's time I step away. A flicker of something, approval, perhaps, passed across his face. He nodded slowly. Then that's what you should do. I let out a slow breath, a weight lifting from my chest. Thank you. Robert stood, offering me his hand. I took it, shaking firmly. You're going to be just fine, Emma, he said. For the first time, I believed it. Walking away wasn't as hard as I had thought it would be. I expected to feel regret, or at least a sense of loss, but instead, all I felt was relief. I had spent years tying my identity to this company, to my role as Ryan's wife, to the idea that success meant holding onto something even when it no longer served me. But leaving didn't feel like failure. It felt like freedom. I spent the next few weeks focusing on myself, something I hadn't done in a long time. I took long walks in the morning, rediscovered old hobbies, and reconnected with friends I had neglected in the chaos of my marriage. And then, one afternoon, my phone rang. I almost didn't answer when I saw Ryan's name flash across the screen. But curiosity got the best of me. I picked up, keeping my voice neutral. Ryan. There was a pause. Then a sigh. Emma. I waited, giving him no easy way in. Can we talk? He finally asked. I frowned. About what? Another pause. I just need to see you. A part of me, some deep, buried part, wanted to ask why. Wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had finally come to his senses. But I knew better now. I had spent too much time waiting for Ryan to change. And I wasn't waiting anymore. So I exhaled slowly and said the only thing that needed to be said. No. Silence stretched between us. Then, finally, Ryan let out a breath. Okay. And just like that, the last thread between us snapped. 6 months later, I heard about his company's collapse. It didn't surprise me. After being removed as president, Ryan had done exactly what I had expected. He had tried to build his own empire, desperate to prove that he didn't need his father, didn't need me. But leadership wasn't about ego, and Ryan had never learned that lesson. His new firm crumbled under mismanagement, bad investments, and his refusal to listen to anyone who told him no. Vanessa, of course, had left him long before the final downfall. I wasn't surprised about that either. It was strange, though, how little satisfaction I felt in watching him fail. I had once thought that seeing Ryan lose everything would bring me closure, but the truth was, I had already found closure on my own. I didn't need his downfall to feel whole again. I had already won, because I had rebuilt my life on my terms. 1 year later, I stood in the office of the architectural trust Robert had offered me a position at, a nonprofit dedicated to restoring historical buildings and preserving the beauty of the past while planning for the future. It was different from the corporate world I had left behind, but it was good, meaningful. I had found something I loved, something that allowed me to build rather than just survive. And as I looked around the bright, open workspace filled with people who actually cared about their work, I realized something. I had been chasing the wrong kind of success for so long. It wasn't about climbing to the top of a crumbling empire. It wasn't about holding on to a title, a marriage, or a name that no longer meant anything. Real success was about building something real. Something that mattered. And as I stepped into my new role, leading my team into the next big project, I knew one thing for certain. I had finally found myself. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, casting golden hues over the architectural plans spread across my desk. I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring the quiet before the day officially began. This life I had built felt like my own now. Not an extension of someone else's ambitions, not a role I had been expected to fill, but something I had chosen. I had spent the last year rebuilding, not just my career but myself. When I walked away from Carter Enterprises, I hadn't been sure what the future would hold. I only knew that I couldn't keep living in the ruins of my past. And now, here I was thriving at Robert's Architectural Trust, leading projects that felt meaningful, working with people who respected me not for my name or my past position, but for my skills and vision. It wasn't just a job. It was mine. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. Come in, I called. A young project manager, Taylor, peeked inside. Hey, Emma, I've got the final numbers on the restoration bid for the downtown project. I smiled, motioning for her to enter. Great, let's go over them. Taylor stepped in, setting the file on my desk. As she spoke, outlining the financials and logistics, I found myself completely engaged. There was something deeply satisfying about this work, about taking something old, something neglected, and bringing it back to life. And maybe, in a way, that's what I had done for myself, too. That evening, after a long but fulfilling day, I settled into my apartment with a glass of wine. My place was smaller than the one I had shared with Ryan, but it felt right. Every piece of furniture, every decoration, had been chosen by me. There were no traces of my old life here, no lingering shadows of a marriage that had collapsed under the weight of betrayal. I had reinvented myself, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I was free. As I flipped through a book I had been meaning to read for weeks, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, my stomach tightening slightly. Ryan. I stared at the name for a long moment. It had been months since I had last spoken to him. The last time I had told him no. No to his half-hearted attempt at reconnecting, no to reopening wounds that had finally begun to heal. And yet, here he was again. For a brief second, old emotions stirred. The instinct to pick up, to see what he wanted, to understand why he was reaching out now. But I had learned my lesson. Ryan's problems weren't mine to solve anymore. I let the phone ring, watching as his name disappeared from the screen. And just like that, the final thread between us unraveled. A week later, I found myself in a familiar place, Robert's estate. It wasn't a visit for business this time, just dinner. Over the months, we had built something closer to family than just a professional relationship. As I stepped onto the terrace, the city lights twinkled in the distance, stretching endlessly beyond the horizon. Robert sat at the outdoor dining table, pouring a glass of wine. "Emma," he greeted, nodding toward the seat across from him. "It's good to see you." I smiled, sitting down. "You too." He studied me for a moment, then said, "You look different." I raised an eyebrow. "Different?" He took a sip of wine. "Lighter." I considered that for a moment before nodding. "I think I am." Robert exhaled slowly, setting his glass down. "You know, when you first walked into my office all those months ago, I wasn't sure if you'd make it out of this unscathed." I chuckled. "Neither was I." He gave me a rare smile. "But you did." I tilted my head. "Did you ever think I would stay at the company?" Robert leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "I hoped you might. You were the best of what Carter Enterprises had to offer. But I also knew you had outgrown it." I let that sink in. "I think I stayed as long as I did because I thought I had to prove something to Ryan, to myself." Robert nodded. "And now?" I smiled, sipping my wine. "Now, I don't need to prove anything to anyone." He chuckled. "That's the right answer." For a long moment, we just sat there, the quiet hum of the city in the background. Then Robert said, "He called me, you know." I stiffened slightly. "Ryan." Robert nodded. "Last week. Wanted to know if there was any way back into the company." I inhaled deeply, shaking my head. "He doesn't give up, does he?" "No," Robert said, then added, "but neither do I." I told him no. I smiled, warmth spreading through me. Robert's voice softened. "You made the right choice, Emma." I met his gaze. "I know." And for the first time in a long time, I truly, fully believed it. As I left Robert's estate and drove back to my apartment, the city lights stretched ahead of me, endless and full of possibility. I had spent so much of my life defining myself by my marriage, by my job, by the expectations others had placed on me. But standing here now, in the glow of everything I had rebuilt, I realized something. True success wasn't about titles or power. It wasn't about clinging to something that no longer served you. It was about knowing your own worth. About having the courage to start over. And as I stepped into my apartment, closing the door behind me, I knew, without a doubt, that I had finally found the life I was meant to live. On my own terms. And that was enough.